Hello and welcome back to another video. So I'm back today with another PC build, and this is going to be a full step-by-step PC build guide where I'm going to be showing you how to put all the parts I've got in front of me together today and come up with a fully working PC by the end of the video. So as well as showing you how to put everything together, I'm going to show you how to install Windows 10, any programs and drivers you're going to need, including any RGB software, and I'll give you a demonstration of how that works. I'll then show you how to enter the BIOS, overclock our RAM, and adjust our fan curves. So if you've never built a PC before, you've definitely come to the right place. So let's make a start and have a look at the parts I've chosen for today's build. For the case, I've gone with SilverStone's latest small form factor chassis, the SUGO 15. So the SUGO 14 and the SUGO 15 share a very similar internal layout. The big difference is the SUGO 15 is their premium model, with all aluminium panels and front USB-C connectivity. And despite being a really small case, you can fit an awful lot of hardware in it, as I'm going to show you today. So it's no surprise with a case this small, we're going to need to use a Mini-ITX motherboard. And the motherboard I've chosen for today's build is from MSI. It's their B550i Gaming Edge Wi-Fi. For the CPU, I've had a last minute change of plans. I was originally planning to put a Ryzen 7 5800X, but I haven't actually built in a small form factor case with a CPU before, so the temperatures I give you at the end aren't going to be comparable to the other cases I've built in. When I built in the NR200P from Cooler Master and Lian Li's TU150, I used the Ryzen 7 3700X. So I'm going to stick with the same CPU, so you're going to be able to compare the temperatures of this case with my other small form factor builds. Keeping the CPU cool, I'm using a 240mm AIO from Cooler Master. It's their Master Liquid ML240 mirror, and this should offer some great cooling performance. For RAM, I've got 16GB of Kingston's HyperX Fury RGB at 3600 MHz. So our motherboard has two M.2 SSD sockets, but because it's a B550 motherboard, only one of them will support Gen 4 speeds. So I picked up two Sabrent Rocket drives, a Gen 4 drive in 500GB of size and a Gen 3 drive in 1TB of size. So our case will accommodate up to 3 SATA SSDs, so I'm going to show you how to install one of these in the build as well. The drive I've picked up is from Kingston, it's the KC600. So although this is a small case, it will actually take a full-size ATX power supply, and I've got a 750 watt fully modular power supply from SilverStone. And SilverStone do recommend using a power supply with a length less than 150mm, so this power supply is going to be perfect for our build. So because we're using a full-size power supply, which can be used in much larger cases, the cables that come with it are going to be longer than what we need. So SilverStone have sent out their flat, flexible, short cable set, which is going to give us an easier time with cable management. For the graphics card, I've decided to go with the ROG STRIX 3080, and despite being such a big card, it will fit in this case, and I'm keen to really push this case as far as we can and give it a really good test. The SUGO 15 does come with one 120mm case fan included. It does have additional fan mounting locations, and we are going to use some of them up with our 240mm AIO. I may or may not use some additional case fans depending on how the components fit, but I do have some additional case fans from Noctua should I wish to use them in the build. Okay, so that's all the parts, let's get on with the build. The first thing I like to do in any build is to prepare the case. By that I mean removing any panels or dust filters or anything else that's going to get in our way during the build. So we'll go ahead and get some of these panels off, and I'll talk you through the main case features as we go. The first thing to mention with this case is you've got two main options when it comes to setting it on your table. You can have it this way with the longer side this way and the shorter side here, or we can actually rotate the case round and have it this way round. So you've got the longer side on the table and the shorter side up the way. So in this orientation, the motherboard is going to be in the back of the case. The graphics card is going to plug directly into the motherboard, but you're going to have a vertical graphics card at the front. If we have the case back around this way here, the motherboard is going to be at the traditional position at the back of the case, and your graphics card is going to be in a horizontal orientation. Obviously with your graphics card in a horizontal orientation, you're going to have no intake at the bottom with this sitting flat on the table. But what Silverstone do is they include 4 legs of 2 different heights. So this is the larger one, and you've got this little one, which is the shorter one. So the idea is you would put these on the bottom of the case, and it's going to lift the case up off the table. So I'm not going to go ahead and put the legs on at the moment, because for example, if I decided I want to have it in this orientation, stick the legs on, and then rotate the case around, the legs at the front stuck there aren't going to look very good. And if I then remove them, we're probably going to be left with some adhesive on the case. So we'll leave the legs to the very end once we decide which orientation we want to have the case in. So one of the nice things about this case is we can remove all the panels on all 4 sides of the case, meaning we're going to have great access to build on it. They're all held on with thumb screws at the back, which are captive, so we just need to go ahead and release the thumb screws. We can then slide the panel backwards and lift it away. The other thing to point out about the panels is they all have dust filters over the perforations. Okay, so with the case set to the graphics card in the horizontal position, the motherboard is going to go at the back of the case here. So this is going to be our front. And we've actually got a bracket here which we can secure a 120mm fan to. I'm going to go ahead and remove this bracket because building is going to be much easier with it removed. So there's 4 screws to remove. Moving on to what will be the top of the case if you mount your graphics card in a horizontal orientation, or the rear of the case if you mount your graphics card in a vertical orientation. We've got a removable bracket. On this bracket we can mount fans, radiators or hard drives. It's again held on with 4 screws, so we'll go ahead and get it removed. To remove the front of the case we need to remove 2 screws at the front. So I'm just going to turn the case over. So with the screws now removed, we should just be able to pull the front of the case off. And you'll be able to see the reason I've removed the front of the case. We've got 2 2.5-inch SSD mounts at the front, hidden behind the front panel. So I'll just loosen these up and these pull out. So we can go ahead and mount our SSDs on here. We've got 2 at the front and 1 further SSD mount in the main compartment of the case. And this is our third 2.5-inch SSD mount in the main compartment of the case. Okay, so giving you a quick run through the layout again. So this would be with our graphics card in the traditional horizontal position, and you can see the PCIe slots at the back, and we've got 3 of them there. We've got a single 120mm fan as an exhaust, and our motherboard would go in here. You can see there's a really large cutout at the back, which is going to be great if you need access to the back of the motherboard for mounting coolers or SSDs. The top of the case is open. This is where the radiator bracket that we removed, so if we install in this way around, the radiator is going to be at the top of the case. And then we've got this cutout for our power supply, so our power supply is going to slide in through here. The other option, as I've mentioned, we can turn the case around like this. So in this position, the motherboard is going to be down here on its back. The radiator is going to be at the back of the case, and our graphics card is going to be at the front of the case in a vertical orientation. And we've got a little support bracket here for the graphics card. I think one of the really nice things about this case, there's so many problems with PCIe riser cables, particularly with Gen 4 technology at the moment. So in this orientation, you've actually got your graphics card in a vertical orientation by plugging it straight into the motherboard. So this is a really nice feature of this case. So this is what comes in the case accessory bag. As we've mentioned, you've got 2 sets of legs for the case in 2 different heights. You've got 2 packets of screws. There is 1 screw that has a little lip around the outside of it, and then the other screw is completely flat. The one with the little lip around the outside is for securing the motherboard to the case and also for securing 2.5-inch drives to the case. The one that's completely flat is for securing your power supply to the case and also for securing 3.5-inch drives. And then we've got some cable ties for cable management. This is our motherboard, and we're going to do as much work with the motherboard as we can while it's on the table. So we're going to go ahead and put our CPU into this socket here in the center of the motherboard, our 2 sticks of RAM into these sockets here, and we've got 2 M.2 SSD sockets, one on the front behind the heatsink, and then one on the rear of the motherboard. So just before we go ahead and put our CPU in the socket, I want to point something out about the socket. If you look at this top left hand corner, you notice a little white circle on the motherboard. And if you look closely at the socket, there's a little triangle on this corner of it. None of the other corners have any of those markings. And this marking is going to help us line our CPU up in the right orientation with the socket. To prepare our motherboard to receive the CPU, all we need to do is open this little clip all the way over to the right hand side. This is our CPU. What you'll notice is I'm holding it by the edges, and the reason for that is I don't want to damage these gold pins on the underside of the CPU. The other thing to point out, if you look at the corner at the top of the screen, it has a little gold triangle on it, and none of the other corners have that gold triangle. And if I turn it over, the same corner, which is now down the bottom left hand side, has a little gold mark. So we're going to need to line this mark up with the mark on the motherboard to make sure we've got our CPU in the socket in the right orientation. Okay, so I've got the CPU lined up in the right orientation. I'm just going to hover it over the socket and let it fall into place. So it's going to move it about gently, and at one point it will fall into the socket like it has done now. I'm not going to go pushing down on it because I can risk damaging the pins. To finish installing our CPU, all we need to do is close the lever, and we've now installed our CPU. To get access to our M.2 SSD socket, we're going to need to remove this heatsink. It's held on with 2 screws. So we need to be careful when lifting this heatsink off. It is connected with a wire which powers this fan, so I'm just going to lift it carefully over to the side. This is our Gen 4 M.2 SSD. You'll notice the gold connectors to the right hand side are what are going to go into the socket on the motherboard. The little semicircle over to the left hand side is where we're going to secure it to the motherboard using a screw from the motherboard box. So this is our M.2 SSD socket. We've got a standoff here to secure the drive to the motherboard. There's an extra hole here where we can move the standoff from here to here if we've got a different length of drive. Just going to line it up, and I can see this standoff is in the right position. What's really important, sometimes when you get the motherboard from new, I have used this one before, there will be an extra standoff here. It is important that you remove that standoff and just have the one standoff in the motherboard that you're going to use. The reason for that, if you have an extra standoff here, it can put pressure on the drive and potentially damage it. The other important thing to mention about the sockets is it's important you check your motherboard manual to see the speeds of each of the sockets. So the one in the front of the motherboard is a Gen 4 drive, the one on the back will only support up to Gen 3 drives, so we need to put our drives in the right socket and put our Gen 4 drive into the front socket. The other important thing to check with your motherboard, sometimes when you occupy the M.2 sockets, it will have consequences, particularly for your SATA ports. Sometimes it will deactivate SATA ports, other times it will reduce the PCIe lanes on your graphics card. There's going to be no reduction in our motherboard that we need to worry about, so we can go ahead and occupy our socket with the drive. Okay, so all we need to do is insert the drive into the socket at a slight angle. Then we can go ahead and secure it into the standoff using the screw that we're going to get in our motherboard box. We can then go ahead and put our heatsink back on. Importantly, if you are using it for the first time, there might be a little bit of plastic protection here that you're going to need to remove. This is our second M.2 SSD socket on the back of the motherboard. You'll notice there's no heatsink on it. So if you do only have one drive, even if it is only Gen 3 speeds, you're better to put it into the front socket because it's going to run cooler. So we've already got a standoff in the right place. So again, I'm just going to insert the drive into the socket at a slight angle. Then I'm going to secure it into place using the screw from the motherboard box. This is our RAM. If you look closely at the gold connectors at the bottom, you'll notice the one to the right hand side is slightly longer than the one on the left hand side. So it's important you line it up in the socket in the right orientation. To prepare the motherboard to receive the RAM, we just need to open these clips on the motherboard sockets. Next, we just need to go ahead and line the RAM up in the socket. Once we're happy things are lined up, it's just some firm pressure at the top and the RAM will lock into place and the clip will close. Same process with the second stick of RAM. We're going to line it up in the socket. Again, once we're happy things are in the right place, some firm pressure and the RAM locks into place. Okay, so I'm just going to slide the motherboard in through the top. We've got a little cutout at the back which we need to line the I/O shield up with. Importantly, this motherboard has the AIO shield pre-applied. If yours doesn't, you should insert it first before inserting your motherboard. Next, we can go ahead and secure our motherboard to the case using the screws from the case accessory bag. So you can see one of the nice things about this case, we've got full access to the M.2 SSD slot on the back of the motherboard. We've got full access to the back plate of the motherboard, so we wanted to change our CPU cooler. We could do this fairly easily in this case at a later stage. The next thing I'm going to do is install our power supply. I want to get our case cables plugged in, but I want to see how the power supply fits in before I do that, so I run them over the right side of the power supply. So our power supply is going to slide in here from the back. This is our power supply, and it's what you call a fully modular power supply because none of the cables are plugged in. The big advantage to this is you only need to plug the cables in that you're going to need to use, and this is going to be a real advantage for a case like this where space is limited. So we need to slide our power supply in from the back. We're going to need to leave the area where you plug the cables in facing backwards. The fan, which is our power supply's intake fan, we're going to want to leave that facing upwards. So it's this way round here. So all I'm going to do is slide this in and all the way along to the back. And you see we've still got plenty of access to plug our power supply cables in at a later stage without any difficulty. Okay, so that's the back of the case now. We've got an extension cable for our power supply, which I'm going to plug in first before I screw the power supply in, because it's going to be a wee bit easier if I've got a bit of movement on the power supply. Line this up and plug it in at the back here. The other really important thing with power supplies, when you're not going to have as easy access to this back switch, because there's going to be a panel over here, is make sure they're switched on when you're installing them. Next, we can go ahead and secure our power supply with the 4 screws from the accessory bag. The next thing I like to do in any build is to get our case cables plugged in, and the case cables are the cables coming from our front I/O. So we've got a HD audio cable, which is going to allow the headphone and microphone jack on the front of the case to work. We've got a USB 3 cable, which is going to allow our USB Type A ports in the front of the case to work. We've also got our Type C cable, and nice to see this is a really flexible cable. And this is going to allow the Type C port on the front of the case to work. We've also got our tricky front panel connectors to plug in, and the reason I say they're tricky is we have to plug all these cables into various pins on one header on the motherboard, and we need to get them into the right pins. This will allow our power switch to work, our reset switch to work, our hard drive LED, and our power LED to work. So let's go ahead and make a start getting these plugged in. So I'm going to make a start with the tricky front panel connectors. They're going to go into this header just above our PCIe slot for our graphics card, and it is the second header in from the left hand side. I'm going to make a start at the top row, working from left to right. So it's really important you refer to the diagram in your motherboard manual to make sure you plug these cables into the right pins. So the first 2 pins are for power LED positive and power LED negative. Next to that we have the power switch, and it goes power switch positive and power switch negative, so that's with the text facing down the way. Okay, that's the top row. Okay, moving on to the bottom row, so it's hard drive LED, positive and negative, working our way from left to right. And then we've got reset switch, negative and positive, so that's with the text facing up. This time it's the odd one out with the text facing up. Okay, there we go. The header just to the left of the one we've just plugged into is for our HD audio cable. We're going to want to plug this in with the HD audio text facing up the way. So we'll go ahead and line it up with the header and push things into place. So our 2 USB cables are down on the bottom right hand side of the motherboard. So we've got our Type C connector here, and just below it our USB 3 cable. Okay, so making a start with our Type C connector, and once we're happy things are lined up, pushing it into place, and then we'll bring the excess cable up the top here. Next I'm going to go ahead and bring our USB 3 cable in. Now importantly, this cable does have a notch on it, and as well the header itself has a notch, so it's important we line it up the right way. In this motherboard it's the notch over to the left hand side. Importantly, take care plugging this in. If there's any resistance, stop and line things up again, but you don't want to damage the pins on the motherboard. So we're going to install one SATA drive in this build, so we're going to need to plug in a SATA data cable, so I think it's a good time to do it now. We've got 4 SATA ports just to the right of our RAM, so I just need to plug this into one of these. Once we're happy they're lined up, push things into place. Next, I'm going to go ahead and plug in our 24-pin power connector cable. Importantly, these short cable extensions have 2 ends to them that look very similar. One has a very short clip on it and one has a much longer clip. The short clip is to go into the power supply, the one with the longer clip is to go into the motherboard. And if we look at the socket on the motherboard, over to the right hand side there's a little notch, so this clip is going to have to go over to the right hand side. Okay, so just a matter of lining things up and pushing things in. Next we can go ahead and plug in our power supply cable, which is going to bring additional power to the CPU, and it's going to go into this header on the top left hand side of the motherboard. Again, it's the same story with these cables. There's a thick end and a thin end. The thin end's for the power supply, so we're going to need to plug things in this way round. There's a little notch on top of it, so we're going to have to line this with a clip facing upwards. Just a matter of pushing things into the socket and the clip will lock into place. We can then run this nice flat cable over the top of the motherboard. So next we can go ahead and plug our cables into our power supply. So our 24-pin cable is going to go into here. That's it into place. And then our CPU power cable is going to go just above it. Okay, so that's those 2 cables plugged in. So the blue slots in our power supply are for our PCIe cables. And our graphics card is going to require 3 8-pin connectors. So this is a 6 plus a 2, which makes an 8-pin. So if we were to plug 2 of these in, we'd actually have used up all the slots in our power supply and be 1 8-pin short. The other cable that comes in this short, thin, flexible cable kit that SilverStone have sent out is an 8-pin plus a 6-pin. But again, that's not going to be any use to us. We're going to be 2 pins short. So I'm going to have to use one of the original power supply cables, which will give us 2 8-pins into one of these connectors. So you can see the difference between the 2 cables. This is one of the ones in the optional kit, and this is one of the original cables, and you can see just how much thicker and longer the original one is. So we are going to make our cable management job so much easier by using this additional kit. So I'm going to go ahead and plug one of the cables from our accessory kit in. And then we'll plug one of the original cables in. And then we can go ahead and feed the ends of these cables down the bottom where our graphics card is going to be. The final cable to plug into our power supply is to power our SATA drives. So we've got a SATA power cable. It's going to go into any of these additional connectors that are left. So I'll go ahead and plug it into here. To remove the drive tray, we just need to loosen the thumb screw. And then it can slide down and away. So this is our SATA drive. If you have a look at the bottom of it, we've got 2 gold connectors. The shorter one is for SATA data, and the cable coming from our motherboard is going to plug into here. The longer one is for SATA power, and the cable that we've already plugged into our power supply is going to plug into here. So we're going to have to mount it with these gold connectors facing up. So the drive's going to need to go on this way. So we'll turn things over. And then what we need to do is screw things into place using the same screws as we used to secure our motherboard to the case. Okay, so I'm just going to bring our SATA cables through this cutout at the top of the case. And then before I install the drive in the case, I normally find it easier to have the cables plugged in. So again, we just need to line the L's up with the drive and the cables. And I'll just push into place. Same thing with the second one. And again, that's it in place. Then all we need to do is slide the drive back into place. And then we can screw in the thumb screw at the bottom. And then I'm going to go ahead and pull the excess cables into the case. So next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to swap out this exhaust fan here for one of my Noctua fans. The reason I'm doing it is our motherboard actually only has 1 fan header on it, so I'm going to have to use a double fan splitter cable for this exhaust fan and also the exhaust fan I'm planning on putting on the front of the case. When I looked at this fan, I was planning on using it, but it's got a 3-pin connector rather than a 4-pin connector. And then we're not going to be able to run both the fans in PWM mode. It's going to have to run in DC mode. And that's the only reason I'm swapping it out. I'm planning on doing lots of thermal testing, so when I do the thermal testing, I'll put this fan back in and test it out and see how it performs. And like I say, if I had more than one spare fan header on the motherboard, I would leave it in. Okay, so we just need to loosen up the 4 screws at the back of the fan to remove it. Okay, we can go ahead and remove the fan. Okay, so we'll just insert the Noctua fan and then screw it in with the same screws we've just removed. Next, I'm going to take my second Noctua case fan and secure it to the bracket we removed from the front of the case at the start, so we'll have it ready to go at the end of the build. Importantly, I have got the front of the fan facing inside the case, so this is going to be an exhaust, hopefully taking hot air from the GPU out of the case. Okay, we'll put that away till the end of the build. Next thing, I've got a double fan splitter cable. I'm going to go and plug this into our motherboard's single case fan header, which is just here, just below the RAM. So we'll go ahead and plug that in. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and plug that exhaust fan that we've got in the case already into that cable. And then we've got a second end of the cable, which will be ready for us whenever we put our front exhaust fan on. So as I've been going along with this video, I've made some changes to my original plans. I'm no longer going to use the Permafrost 240mm AIO. I'm going to use this AIO from Cooler Master. It's their Master Liquid ML240 mirror. The reason I've changed my mind is I want to compare the same hardware as what I used in the Cooler Master NR200p. I think these cases are very similar and I'm really interested in the thermals between the two cases, so I want to use exactly the same hardware in both the cases. So I'm going to go ahead and use this AIO and I'll show you how to install it. The only thing I'm going to do is I'm not going to use the original Cooler Master fans. From my previous testing, the Cooler Master fans were quite noisy. So I've got these Noctua Chromax fans which are optimized for static pressure, and I'm going to use these on the radiator instead. So we're going to go ahead and get the fans on the radiator. So the first thing we're going to need to do is decide what way to put the fans on the radiator. I want the fans at the top as an intake because we're going to get much better CPU temperatures with our AIO as an intake. That's going to mean cool air from outside the case is going to go through the radiator rather than slightly warm air from inside the case, and the cool air is going to give us better cooling potential. So we're going to need to put the front of the fans up against the radiator, and that way they're going to be pulling air in from outside the case. The other important thing, we're going to have to decide what way we have these wires coming. We want these wires to come out the back of the radiator. And I've already lined things up in the case, and I think the tubes over to the left-hand side is going to work much better for us. So this is going to mean this is going to be the back, so I need to turn this around. We get some long thumb screws with the AIO, so I just need to pass these through the fans and screw them into place. So what I'm doing now looks a little bit odd. I've just put one fan on the radiator. Normally when I'm making these videos, I'll put the second fan on and secure it at the same time. The reason I'm doing this is we can't actually rotate our radiator on the bracket into the top of the case with this fan in place. It catches on the pump head once the pump head has been installed. So what we're going to do, we're going to leave this fan off, install this in the case, and then going to put the fan up and then use the thumb screws inside the case to secure it into place. And this is the only way this is going to fit. So while I've got things on the table, I'll talk you through the wiring. So we've got a 4-pin fan connector coming from each of these fans. They both need to plug into our CPU fan header. Fortunately, with the AIO, we get a double fan splitter cable. So I can go ahead and plug both these in. And now we're only going to have one end that we need to plug into our CPU fan header, and that's going to allow the motherboard to control the speed of both these fans. Next, we can go ahead and put our bracket back on. Importantly, you're going to want to have the down text on the radiator bracket facing the back of the radiator. And then we can go ahead and use the screws that came with our AIO to secure the radiator to the bracket. Okay, so looking at our pump head itself, I have used this before, so I have already secured the little brackets to the pump head. If you're using it for the first time, it's just a matter of securing these two little brackets, one on each side, to the pump head. Next, I want to have a look at the connectors coming from our pump head. So we've got two cables. One is a 3-pin fan connector, which is going to plug into our pump header on our motherboard. Importantly, because it's only got a 3-pin connector, we're going to need to run it in DC mode. You need a 4-pin connector to run it in PWM mode. And if you try to run this in PWM mode, it'll run at 100% all the time, no matter what your fan curve is set at. The other connector that we've got is a 3-pin 5V addressable ARGB connector, and this is going to plug into the corresponding header on our motherboard and control the lighting on the pump. Okay, next thing we need to do is apply some thermal paste to the CPU. I normally apply a pea-sized amount in the center of the CPU. Okay, that should do. Importantly, if you are using this cooler for the first time, it will have some plastic protection over the cold plate. I've used it before, so this one doesn't. The next thing we want to do is get the clips on the cooler, these clips here, over the little clips on the motherboard bracket. So I'm going to go ahead and make a start with a clip at the top. Okay, so that's it over the bracket at the top, and then going to lower it down and try and get the bottom one on. Okay, so that's both of them on. All I'm going to do is tighten the thumb screw, so give the top one a few turns, give the bottom one a few turns, and then I'm just going to turn them both together. Okay, that's them tight. Okay, the next thing I'm going to do is to plug in our fan connectors to the 2 pins at the top of the motherboard. So the one closest to the RAM is for the CPU fan header, so I'm going to take the double splitter cable coming from the 2 fans on the radiator, line it up, and then push things into place. The one next to it is for the pump header, so we've got the 3-pin connector coming from the cable on the pump, and again line things up with the header and push into place. The only additional cable to plug in is this 3-pin addressable ARGB cable, which is going to go into the header just down at the bottom of the RAM. Okay, so I'm just going to run the cable for the ARGB in behind the power supply cables. I'm going to line things up with the header, and once we're happy things are lined up, just push things into place. So I'm just having a look at the cables in the case. I'm looking at the HD audio cable and the front panel connectors, and I probably haven't brought them through the optimal route. Where they're going to sit at the moment, they are going to get in the way of the graphics card, and I think they actually would have been better coming down from the top so the cables are out of the way. So I'm just going to reroute them quickly now. Okay, so hopefully that looks a little bit tighter. You can see I've routed these cables beside the HD audio cable. I'm just going to use a little cable tie to tidy them up. Okay, we're now ready to go ahead and put the radiator bracket back in. Before we do, I'm just going to plug our extra fan into the fan splitter cable, which is going into the CPU fan header. And then I'm going to pull the excess cable coming from this out the back. So to get the bracket in, we just need to insert the front of it into the underside of the case, and then we can tilt things down. Just need to clear the cables. There we go, so that's our bracket down. We can go ahead and fix it back on with the 4 screws we took off at the start. Okay, we're now able to raise our fan up to the radiator. I'm just going to pull the excess cable through to the back as I do. And then I can go ahead and get the thumb screws through the fans and into the radiator. Okay, we're now ready to get our GPU installed, but before we do, we're just going to have to remove this little bracket, which will then allow us to remove the slot covers. And then we can go ahead and remove these slot covers. I'm probably going to remove all 3 slot covers. Probably it's just the top 2 that we need, but it's going to be quite a tight fit for the graphics card, so I'd rather make as much space as I can. And with the screws removed, these should just simply move out of the way. Okay, so we're ready to get our graphics card in. And as you can see, it's going to be a fairly tight fit. So I think the first thing I'm going to do is plug the power cables in, because I think once the graphics card is in, I'm not going to have access to the slots at the top. No, so the power supply cables at the back are just pushing the graphics card forward. So I'm going to take it out. And we're going to have another plan for that. So the alternative would be to bring the cables just up at the side of the graphics card, I think is the way we're going to have to go. So I'm just going to swap out that shorter PCIe cable that I used earlier on with the longer one, because I think the longer one's going to make it a wee bit easier to route the cables around the side. Okay, so that's all the cables plugged in. This time the plan is to try and bring them around the side if we can. But before I do that, I'm going to just try and get the graphics card installed in the case. Okay, that's lined up with the socket now. So I'm just going to put a little bit of pressure on the top. And there we go, the graphics card has thankfully seated itself into place. And we'll get it secured into place with 2 of the screws that we removed earlier on. So normally this little bracket will slide to the inside and then you'll screw through it. It's not going to fit in with such a big graphics card here. Now all we need to do is tidy up the cables coming from the graphics card. So I'm just going to pull them round to the side if we can. And the final thing to mention is we've got a little support bracket here which is adjustable, which is going to provide a little bit of support for the GPU. My original plan had been to install a fan at the front in this fan bracket. The problem is I think the cables are going to be right up against the fan. And the only way to get them in would be to really twist the cables and have them right up against the GPU. At the moment they're sitting really nicely, they're not up against anything, they're not under any pressure. So I'm not going to go ahead and install that front fan for now. When I do my thermal testing video, I will add the front fan in and briefly twist those cables up and see does it give you any benefit. Okay, so that's the build complete, and I think it's really hard to believe just how much we have fitted into this small case, particularly when you look at the case compared to the speakers, and the speakers are actually taller than the case. So now we've reached the most important point of any build where we need to switch it on and see does it work. Importantly, I have loaded a Windows 10 bootable USB drive into the back of the PC. If you don't know how to make one of those, I have a video on it, so you can check that out. Okay, moment of truth, here goes. Okay, so there's a good start. The graphics card is lighting up and spinning. I can't really see into the back of the PC to see what else is lighting up. So we just need to keep a close watch on the monitor and see what happens. So having a look at the screen, it's picked up our processor and our RAM and our drives, and it's given us the option to press F1 to run setup or press F2 to load the defaults and continue. So I'm just going to go ahead and press F2. So what we're now looking for the computer to do is find the Windows bootable drive in the back of the PC. If it finds that, it'll boot off it because importantly the SSD that we've installed doesn't have any operating system in it. So the next thing we'll be looking for on the screen is the Windows installer screen, and we can see the Windows logo, which is a good sign, and we're through to the Windows install screen. So I'm going to go ahead and show you how to install Windows 10, but to make things a little bit easier, I'm going to switch over to the screen mode. So as I go through the Windows install, I'm going to pick the options that are relevant to me. It's important you pick the options that are relevant to you and don't just copy me. The other important thing, in between all the steps, everything has been sped up to keep this video as short as possible. So I'm from the United Kingdom, I'm going to go ahead and click Next. I'm going to click on Install Now. So if you've got a Windows key, go ahead and enter it in the box here. If you don't have one, you can click I don't have a product key, and then you can select the version of Windows you're going to get a product key for in the future. I always get the question, will Windows work without a product key? Yes, it will work, but there's going to be some very minor limitations to it. I've got a product key, so I'm going to go ahead and enter mine now. Okay, we need to accept the license terms and click Next. We're going to go for a custom install. Okay, so we can see the 3 drives that we have installed in our PC. Now the question I often get asked is, we've got 2 500GB drives in this PC. How do we tell which is our SATA drive and which is our Gen 4 M.2 SSD? Because obviously there's going to be a massive difference in speed between them. This is very clearly our Gen 3 M.2 SSD. What I have found is that SATA drives tend to come up here before M.2 SSDs, and the M.2 SSD in slot 1 will come up before the one in slot 2. So I'm almost certain this is going to be our Gen 4 drive, so I'm going to go ahead and click Next. This whole process will take a little bit of time, so I'll go ahead and speed it up for you. Okay, so again, I'm going to click United Kingdom, click Yes, and Yes again. I'm going to skip the secondary keyboard. So I'm going to set this up for personal use, click Next. So if you've got a Microsoft account, go ahead and put your details in here. If you don't, you can create an online account, or you can click Offline Account to create an offline account. So I'm going to go ahead and put my details in. We need to go ahead and create a PIN. So I'm not going to use online speech recognition. I'm going to click yes here, yes to find my device, just the required data, no to inking, no again, no again. I'm going to click do it later. I'm going to say only save files to this PC and no thanks. Okay, so that's Windows installed. The first thing for us to do before we install any drivers and programs is to get Windows fully up to date. So we click on the Windows icon, click on the settings, click on updates and security, and click on check for updates. What's going to happen is Windows is going to find some updates and start to install them. It may need to restart the PC a number of times, but we're going to let it restart and keep checking for updates, and we're only going to move on once Windows is fully up to date. Okay, that's Windows fully up to date. Whenever I check for updates, there's no further updates available. So the next thing I want to do is to get all our SSDs to show up, because if we go ahead and click on this PC, what we will notice is only one of our SSDs is actually showing up. So to get them all to show up, we need to go down to the search bar and type in disk management. And then we'll click on the control panel shortcut. When we open this up, we're going to get a pop-up appearing asking us to initialize the disk. So we're going to go ahead and click OK. Okay, so we scan through the list. We can see we've got disk 0, which is unallocated space. Disk 1 is our Gen 4 M.2 SSD. And then if we go down, disk 2 again is unallocated space. So what we need to do is right click on the drive, click new simple volume, next, next. And we just need to give it a name. We're going to click next and finish. And the same thing with our 1 terabyte drive, right click, new simple volume, next, next, next. And next, finish. Okay, and then we go back to this PC, we can see we've now got all 3 of our drives showing up. So I'm now going to show you how to install the drivers we're going to need. I'm going to get these from a variety of places. Don't worry about noting the web pages down as we go, because you'll find them all in the description. Okay, so we're over on our motherboards page on MSI's website. So the first tab we've come to is for the BIOS. So I have already used this motherboard before, and in the last build I did, I updated the BIOS to the latest version. So I can't show you how to update the BIOS today, but if you do need to update your BIOS, you'll be able to find it in one of my other videos, and I have done one specifically for this board. So if you check out the Cooler Master NR200P or the Lian Li 2150, you'll hopefully find a BIOS update in one of those videos. Okay, so we'll go to our drivers, and we'll select our operating system, and we'll expand all these to see what's available. Okay, so the RAID drivers we're not going to need because we're not going to use RAID. The chipset drivers we will use, but we're going to get those directly from AMD's website. The AMD graphics driver we don't need. You only need these if you're going to use a CPU with integrated graphics. We have a card from NVIDIA, we'll get our drivers from them. We are going to go ahead and install the LAN drivers, so I'm going to download the Bluetooth drivers, the Wi-Fi drivers, and the Ethernet drivers. We're also going to install the onboard audio driver, so I'll go ahead and download that as well. Okay, so we'll head over to our downloads folder, and we can see the 4 drives we have downloaded. So we're just going to expand all these, extract all, extract, the same with each of them, right click, extract all, extract, extract all, and extract, and extract. Okay, so we can get rid of these original compressed folders. Okay, so we've now extracted the contents of each of these folders, so we'll go ahead and install them in turn. So we scan down, there's the setup file. Click yes, click next, install. Okay, and finish. And we'll click on the wireless setup, click yes, click next, next, accept the terms, next, we'll go for typical install, and finish. And then we'll do the Wi-Fi drivers. And click on the wireless setup. Click next, I agree, install, yes, and finish. Back to the downloads and then the audio drivers. There's the setup. Yes. Next. And we're going to need to restart our computer. I always think it's a good idea to restart it at the time it needs to be done, so we'll go ahead and do that. Okay, we're now over on AMD's webpage where we're going to get our chipset drivers. So we scan down to chipset. We've got an AM4 socket and a B550 motherboard. Click Submit. Expand here and then click Download. Okay, so there's our chipset application. We'll go ahead and click on it. Click Yes. And we're just going to click on Install. Okay, we're going to need to restart our computer, so we'll go ahead and do that. Okay, we're going to need to get the graphics card drivers from NVIDIA's website. You can either install the drivers themselves or go ahead and install the GeForce Experience. I prefer to install the GeForce Experience, so that's what I'm going to show you. Click Download now. We'll click on Open File, click Yes, and we'll click on Agree and Install. Okay, if you've got an account, go ahead and put your details in. If you don't, you can create one. I'll go ahead and put my details in. Okay, so it's given us a pop-up to change our driver preference, so we can click on these three dots and choose which drivers you prefer. If you use your PC mostly for gaming, click the Game Ready drivers. If you use it mostly for content creation, click the Studio drivers. I use mine mostly for content creation, so I'm going to click on Studio drivers. And then it's going to go ahead and find the latest Studio driver, which we can click Download on. Okay, we can go ahead and click on Express Installation. Click Yes. And it's very normal for the screen to flicker as the drivers are being installed. Okay, we can click on Close. Okay, that's all our drivers installed. The next thing I want to do is show you how to install the RGB software. So we head back to our motherboards page over on MSI's website, and this time we click on the Utility tab. So the Dragon Center is what we're going to need to install to control the lighting on our motherboard, to control the lighting on anything plugged into the RGB header, and to control our RAM. Other people have complained in the past this affects the performance adversely. The other option you would have is when you're in the BIOS, you can just turn the RGB control off on the motherboard if you don't want any RGB. I'll show you how to install this for completeness. Okay, we head over to our Downloads folder and we can extract the Dragon Center. Okay, we can click on the application, click Yes, click OK, and Install. Okay, we can go ahead and open the Dragon Center. So it's going to require us to run it as an administrator, so that's fine, we'll do that. So we'll open it again. This time we're going to right click on it, click on More, and click on Run as Administrator. Click Yes. We need to scan down to the bottom of this list. Click Next. Scan down again. Tick here, and then click OK. And this installation process can take a little while, so I'll speed it up. Okay, we can go ahead and close this down. And to control our lighting, we're going to head over to Mystic Light. Okay, so this is where we need to control the RGB for both our motherboard and our RAM. I say our motherboard itself doesn't have any actually RGB on it, but we need to control what's plugged into our ARGB header, and that is the pump itself. So at the moment we can see it's set to rainbow. This is the light speed, this is the brightness. We can control what we want from here. So if I go into here and, for example, want to turn the lighting on the pump off, I would click off and then apply. And what we can see, the lighting on the pump has now turned itself off. There's a similar option in the motherboard BIOS that will turn all the motherboard lighting off, and I'll show you that when we get to the BIOS if you don't want to install the Dragon Center. So I'm going to turn it back on and I'm going to go for a steady color. So I'm going to click on Steady, and then to get a white we just need to drag this slider all the way to the top, or we can enter the values in here manually and then click on Apply. And what we'll see now is the pump itself has turned to a steady white. If we want to do the same thing with our RAM, we'll click on it. It's picked up the RAM itself. It's currently set to rainbow. We'll just go ahead and do the same thing. Drag this all the way to the top and then click on Apply. Okay, we're now over on our graphics cards page on ASUS's website, and if we scan all the way down to the bottom, in the utilities, it's the Armory crate that we're going to want to get because that's got the Aura lighting. So we'll click on Download, go to the Downloads folder, and then we can extract. We can click on the installer, click yes. Okay, so it's only the Aura Creator that we need, so we're going to click on it and click Start. We can go ahead and launch the application. Okay, so we go ahead and click on the PC components. We can see our graphics card here. What I can do is click on a static color and drag it down to the bar here. We can then customize the static color. So I click on it and turn it to white by typing in the numbers here. I click on OK, and then we can press play to see that. And then we can click on save. Okay, so that's our RGB software setup. Obviously you can go for different effects if you want those. I'm now going to show you how to get into the BIOS. To enter the BIOS we need to restart our computer. So we'll click on the power button and go for restart. Now as the MSI logo appears, we need to press the delete key to enter the BIOS. It can be quite hard to time it, so what I normally do is once the screen goes black, I'll start pressing the delete key so I don't miss it. So the screen's black now, I'm going to start pressing delete. And there we go, that's us into the BIOS. Okay, so the first thing to show you is we have the latest version of the BIOS installed, which is the reason why I didn't show you how to update it. Like I'd mentioned when we were going through the RGB software, you can actually turn the motherboard RGB lighting off by this button here. Next thing for us to do is to get our memory running at the correct speed. We can see here it's running at 2400 megahertz and we know it can run at 3600 megahertz. So we click on the memory tab. We can see there's two XMP profiles enabled. Both of them are the same, so I'm just going to go ahead and turn on profile 1. Okay, next thing for us to do is have a look at the fans and check they're running the way I want them to. So we'll click on fan info and then we'll go ahead and click on the setting tab. Okay, so we can see we're on our CPU fan. It has taken its temperature off the CPU core and running on this fan curve. It's set to auto mode. We do have a 4-pin connectors on the fan, so I'm just going to go ahead and select PWM mode. We can go ahead and click on our pump. So what we can see by default, it's set to PWM mode. Importantly, remember we were plugging our pump into the header, it only had 3 pins on it, so it can't run in PWM mode. What it will do is it will run at 100% all of the time, so I'm going to go ahead and enable DC mode. If we wanted to bring the pump speed down, we could go ahead and click on the smart fan mode. What that would do, it would run the pump then on this curve, and what you'll notice now, the pump speed will be decreasing rapidly. Now I haven't noticed any audible difference in noise levels with the pump speed dropping, so I'm just going to leave it running at a set speed. So system fan 1 is our Noctua fan, which is exhausting out the rear of the case. It's running in DC mode. It does have a 4-pin connector, so it can run in PWM mode, so I'm going to enable PWM mode. And I also normally run smart fan mode on the system fan, so I'm going to go ahead and click that. Okay, so that's all our fans running just the way I want them to. I'm going to go ahead and close things down. So to save all our settings, we just need to press the X button at the top. It's going to give us a summary of what we've updated, and then we just need to click on yes. And then the computer will reboot back into Windows. Okay, next thing to do is check our RAM's running at the correct speed. So we right click on the Windows icon, click on Task Manager, click on More Details, Performance and Memory. So we can see now our RAM is up to 3600 megahertz. Okay, so that's the end of the setup process. Everything is running just as it should, and I think the PC looks absolutely great. I am planning to do some detailed thermal testing for this particular build, and I'll put that together in my case review. Remember to click the like and subscribe button, and I'll see you in the next video.